Welcome to the wild world of ancient Rome. Join Marcus as he throws the biggest party in the empire, where senators make secret deals over wine and exotic dancers. Then go underground to discover the hidden spy network operating beneath Rome's famous bathhouses. Who's really pulling the strings? What secrets are being traded in the steam and shadows? If you love history and juicy secrets from the past, make sure to hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more amazing stories. Tell us what you think in the comments. Which Roman character would you want to meet? Share this with your friends who love epic historical drama. * Rome, 65 C. The marble floors of Marcus Flavius Maximus's villa gleamed like mirrors beneath the flickering light of 100 oil lamps. As the sun dipped behind the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across the Palatine district, servants scurried through the grand atrium, their sandaled feet creating a symphony of preparation. Tonight would be no ordinary gathering. It would be a convivium that the wealthy elite of Rome would speak of for months. Marcus stood in his private chambers, watching his body slave, a young Greek named Alexios, arrange the folds of his finest toga. The garment, woven from silk imported from distant China and dyed with precious murex purple, cost more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. But Marcus was no ordinary Roman. As a senator and successful merchant, his wealth rivaled that of the imperial family itself. "Tell me, Alexios," Marcus said, adjusting the golden fibula that secured his cloak. "What do the common people say about our gatherings?" The young Greek paused, his intelligent dark eyes meeting his master's gaze in the polished bronze mirror. "They speak of excess, of pleasures beyond imagination, some with envy, others with disapproval." Marcus chuckled, a sound that held both amusement and bitter understanding. "They know nothing of what truly transpires. They see only shadows on the wall, like the prisoners in Plato's cave, and mistake them for reality." The truth was far more complex than the lurid tales that circulated through Rome's crowded neighborhoods. These elaborate banquets, which later historians would sensationalize beyond recognition, were indeed venues for pleasure and indulgence. But they were also intricate social and political theaters where the powerful conducted the real business of the empire. As Marcus made his way through the villa's corridors, he could hear the first guests arriving. The sound of laughter and conversation echoed through the marble halls, mixing with the gentle splash of fountains and the soft melody of a water organ playing in the garden. His wife, Livia, had outdone herself with the preparations. The dining hall, or triclinium, had been transformed into a scene from the myths themselves. The room was arranged according to strict social protocol. 3 large couches, each capable of holding 3 diners, were positioned around a low central table inlaid with precious stones and rare woods. The most honored position, the locus consularis, awaited Senator Gaius Cornelius, Marcus's most important guest and potential political ally. Every detail had been carefully planned, from the arrangement of the dining couches to the selection of wines from Marcus's private cellars. Livia approached, resplendent in a stola of deep crimson silk, her dark hair arranged in the fashionable style favored by the emperor's wife. Gold jewelry glittered at her throat and wrists, and her eyes, enhanced with kohl and antimony, sparkled with anticipation. "The dancers from Alexandria have arrived," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "And Quintus has brought his newest acquisition, a poet from Athens who supposedly knew Sophocles in his youth." Marcus nodded approvingly. Entertainment was crucial to a successful convivium. but it had to be tasteful, artistic, and conversation-worthy. These weren't mere drunken orgies, as future generations would imagine, but sophisticated cultural events where wit and intellect were as prized as wine and delicacies. The first course was already being prepared in the kitchens below. Marcus could smell the exotic spices: cinnamon from India, pepper from the distant east, garum fermented fish sauce that added umami richness to countless dishes. His cook, a freedman from Gaul who had trained in the finest kitchens of Rome, was preparing delicacies that would have impressed the gods themselves. Peacocks stuffed with smaller birds, dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds, wine aged in amphorae for decades. As the evening progressed, Marcus observed his guests with the keen eye of a politician and philosopher. There was Senator Lucius, whose vote he needed for the upcoming trade legislation; the wealthy widow Claudia, whose family connections could prove invaluable; young Marcus Aurelius, not yet emperor, but already showing signs of the wisdom that would make him famous. Engaging in spirited philosophical debate with a Stoic teacher, the conversation flowed as freely as the wine Falernian from the legendary vineyards, Cacibon that had aged for 40 years, and sweet Alban wine to complement the dessert course. They discussed poetry and philosophy, debated the merits of different schools of thought, gossiped about imperial politics, and planned business ventures that would span continents. As the night deepened and inhibitions loosened, the gathering would indeed become more sensual. But this wasn't the debauched freefall that later moralizing historians would describe. Roman attitudes towards sexuality were complex and nuanced, governed by strict social hierarchies and cultural expectations. What seemed shocking to later Christian chroniclers was, to the Romans, simply another aspect of sophisticated adult entertainment. The dancing began as the third course was served. Live performers from across the empire, Greeks trained in classical forms, exotic dancers from Egypt and Syria, athletes whose bodies moved with liquid grace entertained the guests with displays of artistry and beauty. Some guests might retire with their chosen companions, but always according to established social protocols and mutual consent. Marcus watched it all, with a detached appreciation of a connoisseur. This was Roman civilization at its zenith, cultured, sophisticated, complex, and yes, indulgent. These gatherings were where the empire's future was shaped, where alliances were forged, where art and literature were patronized, where the wealthy exercised their responsibilities as leaders of society. As dawn approached, and the last guests departed, Marcus stood on his villa's portico, looking out over the eternal city. The streets below were already beginning to stir with the early morning bustle of merchants, slaves, and citizens beginning another day. Soon, the stories of this night would spread, growing more exaggerated with each telling. But those who had actually been here knew the truth that beneath the luxury and pleasure lay a sophisticated society grappling with power, responsibility, and the complexities of human nature. This was the reality of Roman high society, neither the moral paradise that some historians claimed nor the cesspit of corruption that others described, but something far more interesting. A complex civilization where pleasure and politics, art and ambition, philosophy and pragmatism all intertwined in ways that would influence Western culture for millennia to come. 3 days later, Senator Gaius Cornelius reclined in his private study, dictating correspondence to his secretary while the events of Marcus's convivium still resonated in his mind. The marble bust of his ancestor, a hero of the Punic Wars, gazed down from its pedestal with stern disapproval, or perhaps it was merely the morning light casting shadows across the carved features. "The Alexandrian grain shipment," he continued. His voice, measured and authoritative, must be redirected through Ostia rather than Brundisium. "The additional cost will be ... double quotes, remembering a conversation from 3 nights ago, when Marcus had mentioned his shipping connections while they both watched a particularly graceful dancer from Nubia. ... negligible. Given our new arrangements, this was how business was truly conducted in the empire, not in the formal meetings of the Senate, where speeches were made for public consumption, but in the intimate settings where Rome's elite could speak freely, form alliances, and negotiate the intricate deals that kept the Mediterranean world functioning. The secretary, a learned Greek named Demetrius, scratched away with his stylus, capturing not just the words, but understanding their deeper implications. He had served in this household for 15 years and knew well how the threads of commerce, politics, and personal relationships wove together in the tapestry of Roman power. "Shall I include the usual pleasantries to Senator Flavius?" Demetrius asked, referring to Marcus by his formal title. "Indeed. And extend my wife's compliments to his Lady Livia for the exceptional hospitality. The entertainment was ... memorable." That was putting it mildly. The evening had progressed through its traditional phases with exquisite precision. The formal dinner, the cena, had featured 9 courses, each more elaborate than the last. Roman cuisine was far more sophisticated than later ages would remember. Delicate sauces that balanced sweet, sour, and savory elements. Ingredients from across the known world combined with techniques refined over centuries. But it was during the commissatio, the drinking party that followed the meal, that the real magic had occurred. As wine loosened tongues and social barriers softened, the guests had engaged in the kind of frank discussions that shaped imperial policy. The philosopher, Seneca, a frequent guest at such gatherings despite his supposed asceticism, had debated the ethics of slavery with a wealthy Egyptian merchant who owned mines in Hispania. 2 junior senators had formed an alliance over shared appreciation for a particularly talented flute player. A potential marriage alliance between prominent families had been delicately negotiated while the parties involved enjoyed the company of attractive courtesans. The entertainment had been extraordinary even by Roman standards. Professional performers, mimi, histriones, and dancers had demonstrated their arts with skill that bordered on the supernatural. There had been acrobats from the distant lands beyond Persia, their bodies painted with strange designs, who seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. Musicians from Greece had played instruments that could make the listeners weep or laugh at will. And yes, there had been the more intimate entertainments that gave these gatherings their notorious reputation. But even these were governed by elaborate social codes that outsiders rarely understood. The hetera-educated courtesans, who were often more cultured than the wives of senators, engaged their clients in discussions of philosophy and poetry, as much as in physical pleasures. The young men and women who served as companions were often students or artists, using their beauty and charm to gain patronage and advancement in Roman society. Gaius had observed Marcus carefully throughout the evening, noting how the merchant senator handled himself in this complex social environment. The man was clearly ambitious. His guest list alone demonstrated connections that reached from Britannia to Arabia, but he was also cultured and intelligent. The kind of ally who could prove valuable in the delicate game of imperial politics. "Demetrius," Gaius said suddenly, "what did you think of young Quintus Aurelius's performance the other night?" The secretary looked up from his tablets, considering carefully. In this household, His opinions were valued, but he had to be tactful. The young man shows promise, Dominus. His debate with the Stoic philosopher was particularly impressive. Though he seemed somewhat disapproving of the evening's later entertainments, Gaius smiled. The future emperor, though none present, could have predicted that destiny had indeed been somewhat uncomfortable with the sensual aspects of the gathering. His Stoic training showed in his preference for philosophical discourse over physical pleasure, yet he had remained, participating in the conversations that mattered, building the relationships that would serve him well in years to come. This highlighted one of the most misunderstood aspects of these famous Roman gatherings. While they certainly featured sexual entertainment and indulgence, they were not simply orgies. They were complex social institutions where different participants engaged at different levels according to their personalities, beliefs, and objectives. A philosophy student might come for the intellectual discourse, a merchant for the business connections, a young aristocrat to display his wit and culture, a courtesan to find wealthy patrons. The morning light was growing stronger, and Gaius could hear the sounds of the city awakening beyond his villa's walls. In a few hours, he would make his way to the forum, where he would deliver a carefully prepared speech about taxation policy. But the real decisions had already been made 3 nights ago, over wine and entertainment, in conversations that the public would never hear. One more letter, he instructed Demetrius, to Lucius, Annius, Seneca. Private seal, as he dictated, Gaius reflected on the peculiar relationship between pleasure and power in Roman society. The empire's critics, particularly the growing community of Christians, condemned these gatherings as evidence of moral decay. Yet these same events were where the empire's greatest minds gathered to debate philosophy, where artistic innovations were patronized, where the complex negotiations that kept peace across 3 continents were conducted. Perhaps that was the real scandal. Not that the Romans enjoyed pleasure, but that they had created a system where pleasure and responsibility, indulgence and governance, art and politics were so seamlessly integrated. Future ages, struggling with their own moral contradictions, would find it easier to condemn than to understand. But understanding was crucial, because these gatherings were not aberrations, they were expressions of core Roman values. The emphasis on hospitality, the appreciatio for culture and learning, the complex social hierarchies, the integration of business and politics, even the attitudes towards sexuality, all reflected a civilization that was simultaneously sophisticated and pragmatic, idealistic and realistic. As Gaius finished his correspondence and prepared for the day's public duties, he smiled at the thought of the stories that would spread about Marcus's convivium. By the time they reached the common people, they would be transformed into tales of unimaginable debauchery. The reality that the evening had been a successful blend of entertainment, education, negotiation, and yes, sensual pleasure was far more interesting than the myths, but also far more complex. This was the true face of Roman decadence, not mere but a sophisticated culture that refused to separate the pleasures of life from its serious business, that saw beauty and wisdom as equally important, that understood that human beings were complex creatures who needed both intellectual stimulation and physical satisfaction to flourish. The villa of Marcus Flavius. 1 week later, in the private quarters of the villa, Livia Flavia sat before her silver mirror while her body slave, a young woman named Helena, arranged her mistress's hair in the elaborate coiffure that had become fashionable among Roman matrons. The morning sun filtered through the delicate silk curtains that divided the women's chambers from the rest of the house, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. The wife of Senator Cornelius sent a message, Helena said softly, her skilled fingers working ivory pins through Livia's dark tresses. She wishes to know the name of the perfumer you used for the banquet. She was particularly impressed with the scent of the Egyptian lotus oil. Livia smiled, pleased by the compliment. The preparation for a major convivium was an art form in itself, requiring months of planning and the coordination of dozens of specialists. Every detail, from the arrangement of flowers to the selection of entertainers, reflected not just on the host family's wealth, but on their taste, culture, and social sophistication. Tell her it comes from a shop near the Circus Maximus, Livia replied. The proprietor is a freedman who learned his craft in Alexandria. But warn her, his prices are almost scandalous. As Helena continued her work, Livia's thoughts drifted to the complexities of her position as a Roman matron of the upper classes. Modern observers might imagine her as a powerless ornament, confined to domestic duties while her husband engaged in the serious business of politics and commerce. The reality was far more nuanced. While Roman women of the elite classes were indeed restricted in their formal political roles, they wielded considerable influence through their social networks, their management of household affairs, and their ability to facilitate or hinder their husbands' ambitions. A woman like Livia was expected to be not just beautiful and fertile, but educated, cultured, and politically astute. The recent banquet had been as much her creation as Marcus's. She had spent weeks cultivating relationships with the wives and mistresses of important guests, gathering intelligence about their preferences, their rivalries, their current preoccupations. She had personally interviewed every entertainer, tasted every dish, approved every decoration. The seating arrangements alone had required the diplomatic skills of an ambassador. As she navigated the complex web of social hierarchies, personal feuds, and political alliances that characterized Roman high society, Helena, Livia said thoughtfully, "What did you observe during the banquet? You moved through the gathering unseen. What did you notice that I might have missed?" The slave girl paused in her work, considering her response carefully. In this household, intelligent observation was valued, but she had to be tactful about what she reported. The young Senator Aurelius seemed uncomfortable during the later entertainments. He spent much time in conversation with the Stoic philosopher, and departed earlier than the other guests. And what else? The courtesan Aspasia, the one from Athens, seemed particularly interested in forming a connection with the grain merchant from Alexandria. She spent considerable time learning about his trade routes. Livia nodded approvingly. Helena had a sharp eye for the undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of these gatherings. Aspasia was one of the most successful hetera in Rome, a woman whose beauty was matched by her intelligence and business acumen. If she was cultivating the Egyptian merchant, it likely meant she had identified him as a rising power worth knowing. These courtesans were another aspect of Roman society that later ages would misunderstand. They were not mere prostitutes, but educated women who often wielded significant influence in their own right. Many were accomplished in music, poetry, philosophy, and the arts of conversation. They served as companions, advisors, and sometimes even business partners to their clients. Some accumulated considerable wealth and property, and a few even achieved a form of respectability that allowed them to marry into good families. Aspasia herself was a perfect example. Born free in Athens, educated in the philosophical schools, she had come to Rome as a young woman and quickly established herself in the city's cultural elite. She was known for her wit, her learning, and her ability to navigate the complex social currents of imperial society. Men sought her company as much for her intelligence as for her beauty, and her salon was a gathering place for poets, philosophers, and politicians. Did you notice how she handled the conversation about Alexandrian trade routes? Livia asked. Helena smiled slightly. She asked questions that demonstrated genuine understanding of maritime commerce. The merchant seemed impressed by her knowledge of currency exchange, rates, and seasonal shipping patterns. This was the level of sophistication that characterized the better courtesans of Rome. They were not simply beautiful objects, but active participants in the intellectual and economic life of the empire. Their success depended on their ability to understand and contribute meaningfully to the conversations of their clients. As Helena put the finishing touches on her mistress's hair, Livia reflected on the evening's other entertainments. There had been musicians from across the empire, a Celtic harpist whose haunting melodies had moved several guests to tears, Greek singers whose voices seemed to channel the gods themselves, an exotic dancer from India whose movements had been like poetry made flesh. The Romans were great appreciators of artistic talent, and they drew their entertainers from every corner of their vast empire. This cultural synthesis was one of Rome's greatest achievements, the ability to absorb and appreciate the best of every civilization they encountered, creating a cosmopolitan culture that was both distinctly Roman and genuinely international. But it was the more intimate entertainments that would become the stuff of legend and scandal. As the evening progressed and wine loosened inhibitions, guests had indeed paired off with various companions. Some retreated to private chambers within the villa. Others engaged in more public displays of affection. Roman attitudes towards sexuality were complex, governed by considerations of social status, gender roles, and cultural expectations rather than the moral absolutes that would characterize later Christian society. For men of the upper classes, sexual freedom was largely taken for granted, provided they maintained appropriate discretion and respected the boundaries of marriage and social hierarchy. Women's sexuality was more strictly regulated, but even here, the reality was more nuanced than later moralists would claim. Married women, like Livia, were expected to be faithful to their husbands, but they were also expected to be sophisticated about the sexual adventures of their spouses and to handle such matters with grace and intelligence. The new Syrian dancer was quite popular, Helena observed diplomatically. Indeed, I suspect we'll be receiving several requests for her services at private gatherings. Her patron will be pleased that young woman will earn her freedom within the year if she continues to attract such attention. This casual reference revealed another aspect of Roman sexual culture that later ages would find difficult to understand. Many of the entertainers at these gatherings were slaves or freed people who used their skills and attractions to improve their circumstances. For talented and intelligent individuals, particularly those blessed with physical beauty, these gatherings could provide pathways to wealth, freedom, and social advancement. The Romans were pragmatic about human nature and social relationships. They understood that sexuality was a powerful force that could be channeled for social and economic purposes as well as personal pleasure, rather than attempting to suppress or deny these realities. They had created institutions and customs that acknowledged them while maintaining social order. As the morning progressed and Livia prepared for her daily rounds of social visits, she considered the broader implications of the world she inhabited. These gatherings, whether one called them banquets, parties, or by less flattering names, were integral to the functioning of Roman civilization. They were where culture was created and transmitted, where political alliances were forged, where economic opportunities were identified and pursued, where the vast network of relationships that held the empire together was maintained and strengthened. Critics might condemn them as evidence of moral decay, but Livia knew better. They were expressions of a sophisticated civilization that understood the complexity of human nature and had created institutions capable of channeling that complexity in productive directions. Rome's greatest achievement was not its armies or its architecture, but its ability to create a social system that could accommodate and integrate the diverse talents, desires, and ambitions of millions of people from hundreds of different cultures. The silk curtains fluttered in the morning breeze, and Livia prepared to face another day in the intricate social world of Imperial Rome. 6 months later, winter 65 to 66 CE, snow fell lightly on the 7 hills of Rome, a rare occurrence that brought the great city to a wondering halt. In the Subura district, far from the marble palaces of the Palatine, Titus Flavius Clemens pulled his rough woolen cloak tighter against the cold as he made his way through the narrow streets. The contrast between his humble surroundings and the opulent world he was about to enter could not have been starker. Titus was what Romans called a libertus, a freedman who had earned his manumission through years of faithful service. Once a slave in the household of a minor senator, he had been trained as a scribe and accountant, skills that had eventually purchased his freedom and now provided him with a modest living. But tonight, he would witness firsthand the legendary gatherings that all of Rome whispered about, serving as a secretary to record the evening's proceedings. For his new patron, Dart, as he approached the villa of Gaius Petronius, a man whose wealth and reputation for extravagance were legendary even by Roman standards. Titus felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The stories he had heard seemed too incredible to believe. Yet the evidence of extraordinary wealth was everywhere, the marble facade gleaming in the torchlight, the gardens visible through bronze gates, the stream of elegantly dressed guests arriving in litters carried by matched slaves. Petronius himself greeted Titus at the entrance, a gesture that surprised the freedman. The host was a man in his 50s, his hair silver but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and humor. Despite his reputation for excess, there was something thoughtful, almost melancholy, in his demeanor. "Ah, Clemens," Petronius said, using Titus's cognomen with casual familiarity. "You come highly recommended. I trust you have a strong stomach for unusual experiences." Titus nodded, though he wasn't entirely certain what he was agreeing to. As they passed through the atrium, he marveled at decorations that surpassed anything in his previous experience. Frescoes depicting scenes from mythology executed with breathtaking skill, sculptures that seemed to breathe with life, gardens where exotic plants from distant provinces created landscapes of impossible beauty. The evening began conventionally enough. The formal dinner proceeded through its traditional courses, each dish more elaborate than anything Titus had ever imagined. There was dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, peacock roasted with its feathers replaced in brilliant display, wine so old and precious that each cup cost more than Titus earned in a month. The conversation was sophisticated, ranging from philosophy to poetry, from politics to trade, conducted by men and women whose education and culture were evident in every word. But as the night progressed, Titus began to understand the darker undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface magnificence. The entertainments became increasingly extravagant, the displays of wealth more ostentatious, the behavior of the guests more uninhibited. What had begun as cultured sophistication gradually transformed into something that seemed to verge on desperation. There were acrobats, who performed feats that defied belief, dancers whose movements seemed to embody pure sensuality, musicians whose skills bordered on the supernatural. Guests began to pair off with various companions, some of whom were clearly slaves, their status revealed by the subtle collar of gold or silver around their necks. Wine flowed in quantities that seemed impossible to consume, and the conversations grew looser, more revealing, sometimes cruel. Titus found himself recording not just the evening's events, but his observations of the participants. There was Senator Marcus, whom he had met at previous gatherings, now engaged in animated discussion with a young Greek philosopher about the nature of pleasure and duty. The senator's wife, Livia, held court with several other matrons. Their conversation, a complex dance of gossip, politics, and social maneuvering, but there was something forced about their gaiety, something that suggested they were performing roles rather than simply enjoying themselves. As the evening reached its climax, Titus witnessed scenes that would have scandalized the common citizens of Rome. Guests retreated to private chambers or engaged in public displays of intimacy that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior even by Roman standards. Yet even here, he noticed there were rules and hierarchies being observed. The most expensive courtesans commanded respect and attention, while lesser entertainers competed desperately for the favor of wealthy patrons. But it was a conversation he overheard between Petronius and another guest that revealed the true nature of what he was witnessing. "Sometimes I wonder," Petronius was saying, his voice heavy with wine and something deeper, "whether we pursue pleasure because it brings us happiness, or because we fear what we might feel if we stopped." His companion, a younger man whose family had recently risen to senatorial rank through military service, looked puzzled. "Surely pleasure is its own justification. The gods gave us appetites to be satisfied." Petronius smiled sadly. "Did they? Or did they give us appetites to test our wisdom? Look around you, Marcus. Do you see happiness here, or merely the elaborate avoidance of emptiness?" The question haunted Titus as the evening continued. What he was witnessing was indeed extraordinary displays of wealth, culture, and indulgence that represented the absolute pinnacle of human luxury. Yet there was something hollow about it all, as if the participants were trapped in an endless cycle of escalating excess, each sensation requiring greater extremes to achieve the same effect. He watched as a young courtesan, perhaps 16 years old and possessing an ethereal beauty that would have made poets weep, entertained a group of older senators. Her skill at conversation was remarkable, her knowledge of poetry and philosophy evident, yet Titus could see the calculation behind her smiles, the way she assessed each man's potential value as a patron. This was her path to advancement in Roman society, but at what cost? The entertainment became more elaborate as the night progressed. There were tableaux vivants depicting scenes from mythology, with living performers posed as gods and goddesses. There were contests of wit and improvisation that showcased the remarkable education of both hosts and guests. There were musical performances that combined artistic excellence with sensual appeal in ways that blurred the boundaries between high culture and erotic entertainment. Yet beneath it all, Titus sensed a growing desperation. The laughter was too loud, the pleasures too intense, the competition for attention and status too fierce. These were people who had achieved everything that Roman society could offer: wealth, power, culture, beauty, yet they seemed driven to ever greater extremes in search of something that remained perpetually elusive. As dawn approached and the gathering finally began to disperse, Titus found himself walking through the empty halls of the villa, taking note of the debris left behind: scattered rose petals, overturned wine cups, silk garments discarded in haste, the lingering sense of exotic perfumes and spent passion. It was like wandering through the ruins of a civilization that had collapsed from the weight of its own excess. Petronius found him there, still relatively sober despite the evening's indulgences. The older man looked tired, his face showing lines that the flattering lamplight had concealed. "What did you think of our little entertainment?" he asked. Titus considered his response carefully. "It was extraordinary, Dominus. I have never imagined such luxury, such culture, such ... waste." Petronius suggested gently, "I would not presume to judge, Dominus, but you do judge, as well you should. Tell me, Clemens, what do you see when you look at all this?" He gestured at the opulent surroundings. Titus thought for a moment. "I see people who have achieved everything they thought they wanted, yet still seem to be searching for something else. I see great beauty and great sadness existing in the same spaces. I see a civilization at its peak, yet somehow ... double quotes, he hesitated. "Go on." "Somehow afraid of its own success." Petronius nodded slowly. "You see clearly. We have created a paradise, Clemens, but we have discovered that paradise can be its own form of prison. When every desire can be satisfied, desire itself becomes meaningless. When every pleasure is available, pleasure loses its power to satisfy." As Titus made his way back to his modest quarters in the Subura, his mind reeled with what he had witnessed. The great gatherings of Rome's elite were indeed as extraordinary as the rumors claimed, but they were also tragic in ways that the common people could never understand. They represented not just the achievements of Roman civilization, but its contradictions and limitations as well. The snow continued to fall, covering the eternal city in a blanket of pristine white that would be gone by morning, leaving only memories of its brief beauty. Rome. Spring 68 CE, 3 years later. Bronze doors of the Senate House stood closed against the chaos erupting throughout the city, but inside the chamber, the news had already spread like wildfire through the marble corridors. Emperor Nero was dead by his own hand. The Julio-Claudian dynasty had ended, and the Roman world teetered on the edge of civil war. In his villa on the Palatine, Gaius Petronius, once Nero's arbiter of elegance, sat in his private study, penning what he knew would be his final letter. His hands, still elegant despite the tremor of age and illness, moved across the parchment with deliberate care. Through the windows, he could hear the distant sounds of a city in tumult, the tramp of military boots, the shouts of crowds, the crash of statues being pulled down. The age that had created and sustained the legendary gatherings he had orchestrated for so many years was dying, and he would not survive to see what emerged from its ashes. 3 years had passed since that winter evening when the freedman, Titus, had observed his gathering with such penetrating insight. 3 years during which the contradictions and excesses of Roman high society had reached their inevitable conclusion. Nero's reign had become increasingly erratic, his own parties escalating to levels of extravagance and cruelty that shocked even the jaded sensibilities of the Roman elite. The emperor, who had once been a patron of the arts, had become a figure of terror, and men like Petronius, who had helped create the cultural atmosphere that enabled such excesses, found themselves marked for destruction. The charges against him were treason, a convenient accusation that could be leveled against anyone who had fallen from imperial favor. But Petronius knew that his real crime was deeper than any specific act of disloyalty. He had been the high priest of a culture that had lost its way, the architect of entertainments that had ultimately served to distract Rome's rulers from the serious business of governance. The very gatherings that had once seemed like the pinnacle of civilized sophistication now appeared as symptoms of a society in terminable decline. As he wrote, Petronius reflected on the trajectory that had brought him to this moment. The elaborate convivia that had been the glory of his social circle had indeed been marvels of cultural achievement, bringing together the finest minds, the most talented artists, the most beautiful companions from across the known world. They had fostered genuine intellectual exchange, patronized great art, and created networks of relationships that had, for a time, helped hold the empire together. But they had also become ends in themselves, consuming ever greater resources and attention while the practical challenges of governing a vast empire went neglected. The pursuit of perfect pleasure had paradoxically led to a kind of spiritual emptiness that no amount of luxury could fill. The guests at these gatherings had become like actors in an elaborate play, performing roles that had lost connection to any deeper meaning or purpose. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His body slave, a young man named Lucius, who had served him faithfully for 5 years, entered with visible anxiety. "Dominus," he said quietly, "the soldiers are coming. They have orders to arrest you and bring you to the emperor for questioning." Petronius smiled gently at the young man's distress. "There is no emperor anymore, Lucius. Nero is dead, and the future belongs to whoever can seize it first." He set down his stylus and reached for a small vial of poison that had rested on his desk for weeks, waiting for this moment. "But I will not dance to their tune any longer," as he prepared for his final act. Petronius thought about the people he had known and the world they had created together. Marcus Flavius, the senator merchant who had balanced pleasure with responsibility more successfully than most, but who would probably not survive the coming purges. Livia, whose intelligence and grace had made her one of Rome's most accomplished hostesses, now facing an uncertain future as the political landscape shifted beneath her feet. The courtesans and entertainers who had graced their gatherings, whose talents and beauty had provided moments of transcendent joy, but who were now vulnerable to the violence that always accompanied political upheaval. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Such a project would be enormously prestigious and profitable, but also dangerous. Imperial construction projects were notorious for their political complexities, and careers could be ruined as easily as made by association with them. What would be required? He asked carefully. Discretion, competence, and the ability to work with diverse stakeholders. The euphemism was clear. Enough any major project would involve navigating the competing interests of various senators, freedmen who controlled access to the emperor, and the complex web of contractors and suppliers who fed off imperial patronage as they talked. Marcus became aware of the subtle choreography taking place around them. Conversations were beginning and ending according to invisible social signals. Groups formed and dissolved as men moved between the various rooms of the bath. Information was being exchanged, alliances formed, deals struck. The Roman bath was not just a place of physical cleansing, but a crucial node in the network of relationships that held the empire together. A slave approached, with a selection of strigils and oils, interrupting their conversation. Marcus selected a bronze implement decorated with simple geometric patterns, expensive enough to indicate his status, but not so ostentatious as to attract unwanted attention. The oil he chose was scented with lavender from the hills of Gaul, a subtle luxury that spoke to his refined tastes as the slave worked, scraping away the accumulated grime and dead skin of daily life in ancient Rome. Marcus reflected on the institution they were participating in. The public baths were perhaps Rome's greatest gift to civilization, not just the technology that made them possible, but the social vision they embodied. Here was a space where the human body was celebrated rather than hidden, where cleanliness was elevated to a civic virtue, where citizens of all classes could gather in relative equality. Yet like everything in Roman society, the baths also reflected deeper contradictions. They were spaces of social mixing, but also of subtle discrimination. They celebrated the body, but according to strict hierarchies of age, status, and gender. They were open to all citizens, but their maintenance depended on the labor of slaves who could never fully participate in the culture they've sustained. "I'll consider your proposal," Marcus told Pliny as they prepared to move on to the Caldarium. "But such projects require careful timing." Pliny smiled knowingly. Indeed, and timing, as we both know, is everything in Rome. As they made their way through the crowds of bathers, Marcus marveled at the diversity of humanity on display. There were young men showing off their athletic prowess, older citizens taking the slower pace that age demanded, veterans displaying the scars of distant campaigns, merchants whose soft hands revealed their distance from manual labor. Each carried their own stories, their own ambitions, their own secrets. The great bath complex hummed with activity that would continue from dawn until dusk, day after day, year after year. Emperors would rise and fall, armies would march to distant frontiers. The borders of the empire would expand and contract, but the baths would endure. They were more than buildings, they were expressions of Roman values, Roman engineering, Roman social organization. They were monuments to the idea that civilization itself could be, measured by how well it cared for the bodies and spirits of its people. As steam rose from the heated pools and echoed, conversations in a dozen languages bounced off marble walls. Marcus understood that he was witnessing something that would outlast them all, the daily miracle of human community, made possible by Roman ingenuity and sustained by Roman will. The same day, afternoon, the Caldarium of the Baths of Trajan was a marvel of engineering that never failed to impress even the most jaded Romans. Steam rose from pools heated to temperatures that would have been lethal without the careful regulation of the hypercost system below. The domed ceiling, reaching nearly 100 feet above the marble floor, was pierced by circular windows that allowed shafts of sunlight to penetrate the vaporous atmosphere, creating an almost mystical ambience. Marcus descended slowly into the hottest pool, feeling his muscles relax as the heated water enveloped his body. Around him, perhaps 50 other bathers enjoyed the therapeutic benefits of the hot springs, their conversations creating a low murmur that echoed off the vaulted walls. The heat was intense, but not unbearable. Roman engineers had perfected the art of creating environments that pushed the boundaries of comfort without crossing into danger. Beside him, Lucius winced slightly as he adjusted to the temperature. "I sometimes wonder," he murmured, "whether our ancestors would recognize what we've become. They bathed in cold streams and considered it sufficient. Our ancestors," Marcus replied thoughtfully, "lived in mud huts and counted themselves fortunate to survive the winter. Progress has its benefits, even if it comes with complications. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a new group of bathers, led by a man whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere of the room. Senator Quintus Fabius Maximus moved through the steam like a ship cutting through fog, his bearing unmistakably aristocratic even in his nakedness. Behind him came a retinue of clients and hangers-on, their deference visible in every gesture. Marcus had encountered Fabius before, during his work on various construction projects around the city. The senator was known for his intelligence, his political cunning, and his ability to survive the dangerous currents of imperial favor. He was also rumored to be involved in activities that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, even by Roman standards. As Fabius settled into the pool with practiced ease, his eyes met Marcus's across the steaming water. "Severus," he said with a slight nod, "I trust you're enjoying the fruits of your architectural labors." "Indeed, Senator, the engineering challenges were significant, but the results speak for themselves." "Challenges," Fabius repeated, his tone suggesting deeper meanings. "Yes, I imagine there were many. Unexpected complications during construction." Marcus felt a subtle chill despite the heated water. During the bath's construction, there had indeed been complications, cost overruns that were quietly absorbed, materials that disappeared only to reappear in private villas, workers who asked inconvenient questions about structural modifications that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. He had assumed these were the normal corruptions that plagued any large project, but Fabius's tone suggested something more deliberate. "Every major construction faces difficulties," Marcus replied carefully. "The important thing is that they were resolved satisfactorily." Fabius smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Indeed, and some resolutions create ongoing relationships that can be beneficial to all parties." The senator's meaning was becoming clearer. The Roman bath system, with its complex infrastructure and numerous private spaces, provided ideal opportunities for various forms of clandestine activity. Messages could be passed, meetings arranged, and transactions completed away from the official scrutiny that governed more public venues. The very features that made the baths a marvel of Roman. Engineering also made them perfect for activities that required discretion. A slave approached with a tray of refreshments, chilled wine mixed with honey and spices, designed to prevent dehydration in the intense heat. As Marcus accepted a cup, he noticed that the slave's movements were unusually precise, his attention to the surrounding conversations a bit too focused. Not all of the Bathurst staff were what they appeared to be. "Tell me, Severus," Fabius continued, "have you given thought to expanding your architectural practice? There are many private citizens who would value your expertise, particularly those who appreciate innovative design solutions." The offer was tempting. Private clients paid better than imperial projects and offered greater creative freedom. But they also brought their own risks, particularly if those clients were involved in activities that might attract unwanted official attention. "I'm honored by your confidence, Senator, but my current commitments keep me quite occupied." "Of course, but circumstances change, and opportunities arise when we least expect them. Consider, for instance, the recent discussions about tax policy. Such changes can affect the viability of various enterprises, creating new needs and new possibilities." Marcus understood the subtext. If Lucius's rumors about military campaigns and new taxes were accurate, Many of Rome's wealthy citizens would be looking for ways to protect their assets and maintain their lifestyles. This could mean increased demand for luxury construction, but it might also mean demand for the kind of discreet modifications that allowed for the concealment of wealth, the conduct of forbidden activities, or the maintenance of alternative sources of income. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the pool's edge. A young man, clearly drunk despite the early hour, was arguing loudly with one of the bath attendants. His Latin was slurred, but his meaning was clear. He was demanding access to services that were not officially available. Fabius's expression hardened. With a barely perceptible gesture, he signaled to someone across the room. Two men, muscular and alert despite their relaxed postures, began moving through the crowd toward the disturbance. They reached the drunk young man just as his argument was escalating toward violence. What followed was a masterpiece of discreet intervention. The two men simply positioned themselves on either side of the troublemaker, their presence alone enough to calm him. A few quiet words, a firm hand on his shoulder, and he was being led away from the pool area with minimal fuss. To casual observers, it looked like friends helping an intoxicated companion. Only those who knew what to look for could see the professional efficiency of the operation. Regrettable, Fabius commented mildly. Young men sometimes lack the wisdom to appreciate the traditions that govern civilized behavior. Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing. The incident had revealed something important about the social ecosystem of the baths. Beneath the veneer of egalitarian relaxation lay networks of control and influence that operated according to their own rules. Fabius clearly commanded resources that extended well beyond his official senatorial authority. The baths serve many functions, Marcus observed carefully. Recreation, hygiene, social interaction, ... Indeed. And like any complex institution, they require careful management to function properly. The Romans who designed these facilities understood that human nature includes both noble and base impulses. Wisdom lies in acknowledging this reality and creating structures that channel those impulses in productive directions, as if to illustrate his point. Fabius gestured toward a group of men engaged in animated discussion in a nearby corner of the pool. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear, but their body language suggested serious negotiation. Business deals, political arrangements, or something more clandestine, it was impossible to tell. And perhaps that was the point. The Greeks, Fabius continued, believed that the gymnasium was where young men learned virtue through physical discipline. We Romans have created something more sophisticated spaces where all aspects of human nature can be acknowledged and, when necessary, accommodated. Marcus was beginning to understand the deeper currents that flowed through the Roman bath system. These were not simply public utilities, but complex social institutions that served as meeting places, business centers, information exchanges, and venues for activities that required privacy and discretion. The very features that made them appealing to ordinary citizens, the heat, the steam, the crowds, the relaxed atmosphere also made them ideal for purposes that were far from ordinary. A new group entered the caldarium, led by a man whose expensive jewelry and confident bearing marked him as a successful merchant. As he settled into the pool, Marcus noticed that several other bathers seemed to take particular interest in his arrival. Subtle nods were exchanged, positions shifted slightly, and what had appeared to be random social interaction began to look more like a carefully orchestrated gathering. Trade is the lifeblood of the empire, Fabius remarked, apparently following Marcus's observations. But not all trade flows through official channels. The wise merchant understands that success often depends on relationships that transcend the formal structures of commerce. The implications were becoming clearer. The Roman bath system, with its complex architecture and social customs, provided perfect cover for various forms of unofficial economic activity. Goods could be transferred, payments arranged, and contracts negotiated away from the oversight that governed more visible commercial venues. The very publicity of the baths, their status as social gathering places, made them invisible to official scrutiny. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus observed a subtle choreography of arrivals and departures. Men entered alone or in small groups, spent time in various parts of the complex, engaged in seemingly casual conversations, and then left. The patterns were too regular to be coincidental, too purposeful to be purely social. "The hour grows late," Fabius said eventually, rising from the pool with fluid grace. "But I hope we'll have occasion to continue our conversation soon. These are interesting times, and men of vision must be prepared to recognize opportunities when they arise." As the senator departed with his entourage, Marcus remained in the heated water, pondering what he had witnessed. The Roman baths were indeed marvels of engineering and social organization, but they were also something more complex and potentially dangerous. They were spaces where the official and unofficial economies intersected, where political networks operated alongside commercial ones, where the empire's public face concealed a web of private arrangements and clandestine activities. The steam continued to rise, carrying with it the secrets and whispered plans of an empire at its height, beautiful, sophisticated, and built on foundations that were more complex and precarious than most citizens ever realized. Later that afternoon, the women's section in a separate wing of the baths of Trajan, divided from the men's quarters by thick marble walls and ironclad tradition. Claudia Maxima made her way through the women's apoditerium with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. As the wife of a wealthy senator and daughter of a distinguished military family, she moved through Roman society with authority that few women of any era would enjoy. Yet even her elevated status operated within the complex constraints that governed feminine life in the empire. The women's baths were no less magnificent than their male counterparts, though they served a smaller population and operated on a more intimate scale. Marble columns supported gracefully arched ceilings. Mosaics depicted scenes of Venus and her attendants, and the same hypocaust system that heated the men's quarters maintained perfect temperatures in pools designed specifically for feminine comfort and conversation. Claudia's personal attendants, 3 slave women whose training had cost more than many Romans earned in a lifetime, helped her disrobe and arrange her jewelry in the secure niches provided for valuables. Her stola, woven from the finest silk and dyed with precious purple, was worth a small fortune. But her jewelry was even more valuable. Pearls from the distant shores of Britannia, emeralds from Egyptian mines, gold worked by craftsmen whose skills had been refined over generations. Domina whispered her chief attendant, a young Greek woman named Lydia, whose intelligence had earned her special privileges within the household. "The Lady Agrippina is already in the tepidarium. She specifically inquired about your plans for this afternoon." Claudia nodded thoughtfully. Agrippina, not the infamous mother of Nero, but her great-niece, who had inherited both the family name and its talent for political intrigue, was not a woman who left social encounters to chance. If she had arranged to encounter Claudia at the baths, it was because she had something significant to discuss. The women's tepidarium was a study in refined elegance. Its proportions slightly smaller than the men's version, but no less impressive in its architectural sophistication. Perhaps 20 women reclined on marble benches, their conversations creating a gentle murmur that was punctuated by the splash of water and the soft scraping of strigils against skin. Unlike the men's quarters, where political and commercial discussions dominated, the women's conversations covered a broader range of topics: family news, social gossip, cultural observations, and the subtle negotiations that governed aristocratic marriages and alliances. Agrippina was indeed waiting, positioned strategically in a corner where their conversation would be relatively private. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, her beauty maintained through careful diet, exercise, and the ministrations of skilled cosmetic artists. Her presence commanded attention even in this gathering of Rome's most privileged women. "Claudia, my dear," she said warmly, though her eyes remained calculatingly cool. "How fortunate that our schedules have aligned." "I was just discussing with Julia." She nodded toward a younger woman nearby the upcoming marriage negotiations between the Cornelian and Flavian families. This was significant news. Marriage alliances among Rome's aristocratic families were political events that could shift the balance of power in the Senate, affect commercial relationships across the Mediterranean, and influence imperial policy for years to come. Such discussions took place in venues like the women's baths, because they required the kind of privacy and informality that formal settings could not provide. "Indeed," Claudia replied carefully. "Such arrangements require delicate handling. There are so many factors to consider: financial, political, personal compatibility, ... Precisely. And timing, of course, is crucial. Recent events have complicated certain relationships." Agrippina's tone suggested deeper currents than the surface conversation revealed. As they settled into the warm pool of the tepidarium, Claudia observed the social dynamics that characterized this feminine realm. The women's baths served many of the same functions as the men's networking: information exchange, business discussion, but they operated according to different rules and customs. Here, power was exercised through influence rather than direct authority, through relationships rather than formal position, through subtle manipulation rather than overt command. A slave approached with oils and perfumes, presenting them for selection on a silver tray. Claudia chose a blend of rose and myrrh, expensive enough to indicate her status, but not so exotic as to suggest ostentation. The process of anointing and scraping was as much ritual as hygiene, a daily ceremony that reinforced social hierarchies while providing opportunities for private conversation. "Tell me," Agrippina continued, "what do you hear from your husband about the emperor's eastern plans? There are rumors of new military campaigns, which could affect so many of our ... arrangements." The question was loaded with implications. Military campaigns meant new taxes, which affected everyone's finances. They also meant opportunities for profit through supply contracts, for advancement through military service, and for acquiring wealth through conquest. But they also carried risks: failed campaigns could destroy careers, and successful ones could elevate rivals to dangerous heights. Marcus mentions that the engineering requirements would be substantial. Claudia replied diplomatically: "Aqueducts, roads, fortifications, the costs would be enormous." "Yes, and costs must be met somehow. I've heard that certain alternative revenue sources are being explored. Activities that have previously operated in shadow might need to become more ... systematic." Claudia understood the implication. The Roman economy included substantial, unofficial element smuggling, tax avoidance, private banking, various forms of what later ages would call organized crime. During times of financial stress, the government might be forced to formalize some of these activities, bringing them under official control in exchange for taxation and regulation. There, conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a new group of women, led by someone whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the room. Poppaea, not Nero's wife, but a distant relative who had inherited the family's legendary beauty and ambition, entered with an entourage that included several young women whose stunning appearance marked them as high-class courtesans or actresses. That social dynamics became immediately more complex, while respectable matrons like Claudia and Agrippina maintained their dignity through strict adherence to moral conventions. Women like Poppaea operated in a gray area where beauty, intelligence, and sexual appeal could be converted into wealth and influence. The tension between these different modes of feminine power was always present in Roman society, and venues like the women's baths were among the few places where such different women could interact on relatively equal terms. "Ladies," Poppaea said with a gracious nod that acknowledged the other women's status while asserting her own confidence. What a pleasant surprise to encounter such distinguished company. The exchange that followed was a masterpiece of social negotiation. Agrippina and Claudia could not ignore Poppaea without appearing petty, but neither could they embrace her without compromising their own reputations. Poppaea, for her part, needed to show appropriate respect while maintaining her own dignity and the standing of her companions. "We were just discussing the marriage negotiations between prominent families," Agrippina said carefully. "Such arrangements require careful consideration of all relevant factors." "Indeed," Poppaea replied smoothly. "Compatibility is so important, whether in marriage or in other forms of partnership. I find that successful relationships often depend on mutual understanding and shared interests." The subtext was clear. In a society where arranged marriages were the norm and romantic love was considered a luxury rather than a necessity, many aristocratic men maintained relationships with courtesans or mistresses who could provide intellectual and emotional companionship that their wives could not offer. These relationships were tolerated, provided they were conducted with appropriate discretion and did not threaten the stability of family alliances. As the conversation continued, Claudia observed the careful dance of status and influence that characterized this feminine realm. Information flowed along networks that paralleled but remained separate from the male power structures that officially governed Roman society. Women who could not vote or hold office nevertheless wielded considerable influence through their roles as wives, mothers, hostesses, and in some cases, through their beauty and charm. The women's baths served as a crucial node in these networks. Here, aristocratic wives could gather intelligence about political developments. Courtesans could cultivate relationships with influential families, and women from different social levels could negotiate arrangements that served their mutual interests. The architecture itself supported these functions: private alcoves for intimate conversations, larger pools for social gatherings, and discreet passages that allowed for arrivals and departures that might not be observed by unwanted eyes. A massage table was prepared in an adjacent chamber, and Claudia made her way there, accompanied by Lydia and another attendant. The massage itself was performed by a skilled slave woman whose knowledge of anatomy and therapeutic techniques had been developed through years of practice. But the real purpose was the privacy it provided for continued conversation with Agrippina, who had arranged for her own massage at the same time. "I've heard interesting rumors about your husband's architectural projects," Agrippina said, as skilled hands worked aromatic oils into her skin. "Apparently some of his recent commissions have involved unusual specifications." Claudia's pulse quickened. Marcus had indeed been working on several private projects that seemed to require modifications that went beyond normal. Architectural needs, hidden chambers, discreet entrances, soundproof rooms. She had assumed these were simply the eccentricities of wealthy clients. But Agrippina's comments suggested something more systematic. "Wealthy Romans often have particular requirements," she replied carefully. "Privacy, security, accommodation for various forms of entertainment, ... double quotes, of course. And in uncertain times, such requirements become more ... pressing. I imagine there will be considerable demand for architects who understand how to balance functionality with discretion." As the massage continued and their conversation grew more intimate, Claudia began to understand that she was being recruited for something. The women's networks of influence and information were being mobilized for purposes that extended beyond social gossip and marriage negotiations. In times of political and economic uncertainty, these networks could serve more serious functions: intelligence gathering, resource coordination, even resistance to official policies that threatened aristocratic interests. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as Claudia Macaea completed her bathing routine and prepared to return home. As she dressed with the help of her attendants, she reflected on the complex world she inhabited. The women's baths were not simply places of leisure and gossip, but crucial institutions where feminine power operated according to its own rules and purposes. Here, away from direct male oversight, women could form alliances, share information, and coordinate activities that would have been impossible in more public settings. As her litter carried her through the darkening streets of Rome, Claudia pondered the invitation that had been subtly extended. The empire was changing, new pressures were emerging, and those who wished to protect their interests would need to adapt to new realities. The networks that had sustained aristocratic power for generations were being called upon to serve in new ways, and the women's baths would undoubtedly play a crucial role in whatever was to come. Evening, the same day, underground chambers, the hypocaust tunnels beneath the baths of Trajan formed a hidden city that few Romans ever saw. Here, in chambers carved from living rock and lined with hit-resistant brick, an army of slaves maintained the complex systems that made the bathing experience possible. The air was thick with smoke and steam, the heat nearly unbearable, and the constant roar of furnaces created an environment that seemed more hellish than civilized. Gaius, a slave whose intelligence had earned him the position of chief engineer for the hypocaust system, moved through these tunnels with the confident stride of a man who knew every pipe, every valve, every potential point of failure in the massive installation. His body bore the scars of 20 years working in these conditions, burns from steam pipes, cuts from metal edges, the perpetual grime that marked those who labored in the empire's hidden depths. But tonight, as he made his routine inspection of the system, Gaius carried knowledge that extended far beyond the technical requirements of his job. Over the years, his position had given him access to information that most slaves could never obtain. The hypocaust tunnels connected to every part of the bath complex, and sounds carried through the heating ducts in ways that the architects had never intended. Conversations that citizens thought were private often echoed through the underground chambers, where sharp ears and intelligent minds could piece together fragments into meaningful intelligence. Marcus, he called softly to a younger slave who was tending one of the main furnaces. The third duct from the east wall, have you noticed any unusual echoes today? Marcus looked up from his work, sweat streaming down his face from the intense heat. He was one of the newer slaves, captured during Trajan's Dacian campaigns and still adjusting to life in Roman bondage. But his quick mind and steady hands had quickly earned him a position of relative responsibility within the underground crew. Yes, actually. This afternoon there were voices, Roman voices, speaking about military campaigns and tax changes. The conversation seemed ... urgent. Gaius nodded thoughtfully. The heating ducts that carried warm air to the caldarium also transmitted sound, and he had learned to interpret the acoustic patterns that revealed when important conversations were taking place above. Today had been particularly active, with multiple discussions that suggested significant events were developing in the upper levels of Roman society as they worked. Moving through the maze of tunnels that honeycombed the foundation of the bath complex, Gaius reflected on the strange position he occupied in Roman society. As a slave, he was officially non-human, property to be bought and sold like any other commodity. Yet his technical expertise made him invaluable, and his years of service had earned him a degree of trust and authority that many free citizens never achieved. He managed a staff of nearly 50 slaves, oversaw maintenance of one of Rome's most complex mechanical systems, and possessed detailed knowledge of the bath's hidden architecture. More importantly, his position had given him access to information that could be extraordinarily valuable to the right people. Conversations overheard through heating ducts, patterns of behavior observed through hidden vantage points, relationships mapped through careful observation, of who met with whom and when. All of this intelligence flowed through the slave networks that operated parallel to and largely invisible from the official structures of Roman society. There's something else, Marcus said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Earlier today, I saw Senator Fabius in one of the restricted areas near the women's quarters. He wasn't alone. This was significant. The bath complex contained numerous spaces that were officially off-limits: maintenance areas, storage chambers, passages designed for staff movement. Access to these areas was strictly controlled, and their use by patrons would require special arrangements and considerable discretion. If prominent citizens were using such spaces for private meetings, it suggested activities that went beyond normal social interaction. Gaius made his way to a particular section of the tunnel system that he had discovered during his first year of service. Here, a construction error had created a chamber that was connected to the main hypercost system, but not officially part of the building's design. Over the years, he had carefully improved this space, installing better ventilation, adding storage niches, even creating a small study area where he could read and write away from the constant supervision that characterized slave life. From a hidden compartment, he retrieved a collection of wax tablets on which he had been recording his observations over the past several months. The information they contained would have been worth a fortune to various interested parties. Details about who met with whom, when sensitive conversations took place, which citizens were involved in activities that might interest imperial investigators. But Gaius had not yet decided how to use this intelligence. As a slave, his options were limited. He could attempt to sell the information, but that would involve risks that could easily prove fatal. He could share it with other slaves, building the kind of intelligence network that had helped previous slave revolts. But such activities were extraordinarily dangerous and usually unsuccessful. Or he could wait, continuing to gather information while looking for opportunities that might offer genuine paths to freedom and security. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He quickly concealed the tablets and prepared to resume his normal duties. But the footsteps passed by his hiding place without stopping. Still, the incident reminded him of the constant surveillance that characterized slave life. Even for those in positions of relative authority, as the evening wore on, Gaius conducted his normal rounds through the hypercost system, checking furnace temperatures, adjusting water flow rates, ensuring that the complex machinery continued to function smoothly. But his mind was occupied with larger questions about the information he had been gathering and the possibilities it might create. The slave networks that operated throughout Rome were far more sophisticated than most free citizens realized. Information flowed along chains of communication that connected households, workshops, markets, and public buildings across the city. Slaves who served as messengers, cooks, secretaries, and laborers were perfectly positioned to observe the activities of their masters and to share intelligence with others in similar positions. In recent months, these networks had been buzzing with rumors about political changes, military preparations, and economic pressures that seemed to be building toward some kind of crisis. The conversations Gaius had overheard in the baths confirmed many of these rumors, while adding new details that painted a picture of an empire under increasing strain. Gaius, a voice called from the darkness of the tunnels. He turned to see Demetrius, an older slave who served as a messenger for several prominent households. Demetrius was one of the most well-connected individuals in Rome's slave community. A man whose intelligence and reliability had made him a crucial node in the informal communication networks that kept the empire functioning at the practical level. "Demetrius," Gaius replied warmly, "what brings you to the tunnels at this hour?" "Business that requires privacy," the older man said cryptically. "There are developments that certain people need to know about people who might be interested in information that only someone in your position could provide." Gaius felt his pulse quicken. For months, he had been wondering whether his intelligence gathering had been noticed by others, and whether opportunities might exist to convert his knowledge into something more valuable than personal satisfaction. Demetrius's presence suggested that such opportunities might indeed be available. "What kind of people?" he asked carefully. "People with resources, people with influence, people who understand that information is the most valuable commodity in the empire, and who are willing to pay appropriately for reliable intelligence." The implications were both exciting and terrifying. The sale of sensitive information could provide pathways to freedom and wealth that were otherwise impossible for slaves to achieve. But it could also lead to torture, execution, and the destruction of everyone associated with such activities. The Roman authorities took a dim view of slaves who trafficked in political intelligence, and the punishments for such crimes were designed to serve as deterrents to others who might consider similar ventures. "Such arrangements would require careful handling," Gaius said thoughtfully. "Indeed, but the rewards could be ... substantial. Freedom, certainly. Wealth, possibly. And the satisfaction of using one's abilities for purposes that extend beyond the daily maintenance of Roman luxury." As they talked, moving through the tunnels with the casual air of slaves conducting routine business, Gaius began to understand that he was being recruited for something larger than simple information brokering. The slave networks of Rome were being mobilized for purposes that went beyond their traditional functions of communication and mutual support. In times of political uncertainty, these networks could serve as intelligence services, resistance organizations, even revolutionary movements. But the immediate opportunity was more modest and more practical. Certain individuals, Demetrius was careful not to specify, who were interested in establishing a systematic intelligence operation based in the public baths. The combination of social mixing, private conversations, and architectural features that supported discreet observation made the baths ideal for such purposes. And Gaius's position as chief engineer for the hypercost system made him perfectly situated to coordinate such activities. Consider the possibilities, Demetrius said as they paused beside one of the main furnaces. Senators, merchants, generals, imperial administrators, they all come here. They all relax their guard. They all engage in conversations that reveal their true intentions and capabilities. With the right organization and the right intelligence gathering methods, it would be possible to map the real power structures of the empire. Gaius understood the appeal, but he also understood the risks. Roman society was built on a foundation of surveillance and control that extended far beyond the official instruments of law enforcement. Informers, spies, and agents, provocateurs, operated at every level of society, and activities that seemed private and secure could quickly be exposed to hostile scrutiny. Such an operation would need to be carefully structured, he said. Multiple layers of security, compartmentalized information, protected communication channels, precisely. And it would need to be led by someone with deep knowledge of the technical systems, extensive observation experience, and the intelligence to manage complex operations without detection. The recruitment pitch was clear, and Gaius found himself both attracted and repelled by the possibilities it presented. On one hand, it offered a path toward freedom and meaningful work that used his abilities for purposes beyond simple maintenance. On the other hand, it involved risks that could easily prove fatal, not just for him, but for everyone associated with the operation. As the night deepened and the baths gradually emptied of patrons, Gaius made his final rounds through the hypercost system, ensuring that the furnaces were properly banked and that the heating system would maintain appropriate temperatures. Through the night, but his mind was occupied with larger questions about identity, purpose, and possibility. The Roman baths were marvels of engineering and social organization, but they were also expressions of a society built on systematic exploitation and inequality. The citizens who enjoyed the luxury of heated pools and massage services rarely thought about the army of slaves who made such pleasures possible. The conversations they held about politics and business assumed a social order in which they were permanently privileged and others permanently subordinated. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly stable system lay currents of intelligence, ambition, and potential resistance that could reshape the empire's future. Slaves like Gaius possessed knowledge and capabilities that their masters rarely recognized, and the networks that connected them could serve purposes far beyond their intended functions. As he prepared to settle into his small, sleeping alcove in the underground chambers, Gaius reflected on the choice that Demetrius had presented. He could continue his current existence, valuable, relatively comfortable, but ultimately limited by his slave status. Or he could risk everything on the possibility that intelligence and courage could create opportunities for fundamental change. The sound of water flowing through hidden pipes, and the distant glow of banked furnaces created an atmosphere that was both peaceful and ominous. Somewhere above, in the marble halls and heated pools, the empire's elite continued their eternal dance of pleasure, politics, and power. But below, in the shadowy realm that made their luxury possible, other dancers were beginning dances that might ultimately prove more significant than anything that took place in the world. Above, the secrets of the Roman bathhouses ran deeper than most citizens ever imagined, and the true story of these magnificent institutions was only beginning to unfold. 3 weeks later, Dunther, Praetorian Guard, arrived at the baths of Trajan just as the first light of dawn touched the marble columns of the entrance. Their bronze armor gleamed in the early morning sun, and their disciplined formation contrasted sharply with the peaceful atmosphere that usually characterized the bath complex at this early hour. Citizens who would come for their morning ablutions quickly scattered, recognizing the signs of an imperial investigation that could sweep up the innocent along with the guilty. Tribune Marcus Salvius Otho commanded the detachment with the cold efficiency that had made him one of Emperor Trajan's most trusted enforcers. His intelligence network had been tracking suspicious activities centered on the public baths for several months, and recent developments had provided him with enough evidence to justify a full investigation. What he had discovered threatened to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Roman society. Seal all entrances, he commanded his centurions. No one enters or leaves without authorization. Begin with the underground chambers, that's where we'll find the evidence we need. As the Praetorians moved through the complex with practiced precision, Otho reflected on the intelligence that had brought him to this point. The Roman baths had always been venues where information could be exchanged and relationships formed away from official oversight. But recent investigations had revealed that these informal networks had evolved into something far more systematic and potentially dangerous. It had begun with routine surveillance of known political dissidents, individuals whose activities warranted periodic monitoring, but who had not yet committed crimes serious enough to justify arrest. Following their movements and associations had led investigators to the bath complex, where patterns of behavior suggested coordinated intelligence gathering and information sharing that went far beyond casual social interaction. The breakthrough had come when one of Otho's agents, posing as a wealthy merchant, had been approached by intermediaries offering to sell sensitive political and military intelligence. The prices demanded were substantial, the information offered was remarkably detailed and current, and the sophistication of the operation suggested professional organization rather than amateur. Opportunism by further investigation had revealed that the bath's hyper-cost system provided ideal infrastructure for clandestine activities. The maze of tunnels and chambers beneath the building created spaces that were difficult to monitor and easy to use for private meetings. The constant noise of furnaces and water systems masked conversations that might otherwise be overheard, and the slave workforce that maintained these systems included individuals with access to information that could be extraordinarily valuable to hostile intelligence services. Tribune called out one of his centurions, emerging from a stairway that led to the underground chambers. "We've found something you should see." Otho descended into the hypocaust tunnels, marveling at the engineering sophistication that surrounded him. The Roman genius for practical innovation was evident in every aspect of the heating system, from the precise arrangement of flues that carried hot air to the ingenious valves that regulated water temperature. But his admiration was tempered by the knowledge that this same engineering had been turned to purposes its designers never intended. The centurion led him to a hidden chamber that had been discovered during the search of the slave quarters. Inside, investigators had found a cache of wax tablets containing detailed records of conversations overheard in various parts of the bath complex. Names, dates, topics of discussion, assessments of political relationships, all meticulously recorded and organized for easy reference. The slave who created this was clearly intelligent and well-educated, the centurion reported. The records go back several months and show systematic intelligence gathering rather than casual eavesdropping. Otho examined the tablets with growing amazement. The information they contained was remarkably comprehensive, covering not just political discussions, but also business negotiations, family relationships, and personal scandals that could be used for blackmail or manipulation. Someone had been conducting a professional intelligence operation using the bath complex as their base of operations. "Where is this slave now?" he asked. "Escaped, apparently. His supervisor says he disappeared 3 days ago, along with several other slaves who worked in sensitive positions. We're conducting a citywide search, but they seem to have had advance warning of our investigation." This was troubling, but not entirely surprising. Intelligence operations of this sophistication usually included contingency plans for exposure and escape. The fact that key personnel had disappeared before the raid suggested either exceptional security consciousness or advance warning from sources within the official apparatus. As the investigation continued throughout the morning, a clearer picture began to emerge of what had been transpiring beneath the surface of Rome's most popular public amenity. The bath complex had indeed served as the center of a sophisticated intelligence network that collected information from across the empire's political and economic elite. But this was not simply criminal activity conducted for personal profit. The scope and organization suggested purposes that were potentially much more serious. Tribune, another centurion, reported, "We've arrested several individuals who were attempting to leave the complex when we arrived. One of them is Senator Fabius, who claims he was here for routine morning exercise." Otho smiled grimly. Fabius's presence was not coincidental. The senator's name had appeared frequently in the intercepted intelligence reports, usually in connection with discussions of military planning and imperial finances. His attempt to leave just as the Praetorians arrived suggested either unfortunate timing or guilty knowledge. The interrogation of arrested suspects revealed additional details about the network's operations. Information had been gathered not just through eavesdropping in the hypo-cost tunnels, but through a complex system that included slaves in prominent households, freedmen in commercial enterprises, and even some citizens who had been recruited through various forms of persuasion or coercion. The intelligence had then been processed, analyzed, and sold to various buyers who included foreign governments, commercial rivals, and political factions seeking advantages over their competitors. Some of the information had apparently been used to manipulate markets, influence government decisions, and blackmail prominent individuals into cooperation with the network's objectives. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence suggesting that the network had been coordinating with similar operations in other cities throughout the empire. Messages found in the hidden chamber referenced contacts in Alexandria, Athens, Antioch, and other major urban centers. What had appeared to be a local criminal enterprise was apparently part of a much larger organization with capabilities that could threaten imperial security. As afternoon arrived and the investigation expanded beyond the bath complex itself, Otho found himself contemplating the broader implications of what had been uncovered. The Roman baths were indeed marvels of engineering and social organization, but they had also become venues for activities that their designers never intended. The very features that made them appealing to ordinary citizens, the social mixing, the relaxed atmosphere, the architectural complexity, had also made them ideal for purposes that challenged the foundations of imperial authority. More troubling was the realization that the network's activities revealed serious vulnerabilities. In Roman societies, information security, if slaves and freedmen could systematically gather intelligence about the empire's most sensitive political and military discussions, then potential enemies had access to knowledge that could be used to devastating effect. The investigation will need to expand. Significantly, he reported to his superiors that evening. What we've discovered here appears to be part of a much larger operation with implications for imperial security. Throughout the Mediterranean world, the secrets of the Roman bathhouses had indeed run deeper than anyone had imagined. Beneath the marble facades and heated pools lay networks of information and influence that operated according to their own rules and served their own purposes. The institutions that Romans had created to celebrate their civilization's achievements had also become instruments that could be used to undermine its stability. As the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across the bath complex that now stood empty and under guard, Otho reflected on the paradoxes of imperial power. The Romans had built the greatest civilization in human history, but that same civilization had created opportunities for its enemies that previous generations could never have imagined. The very sophistication that made Roman society so successful also made it vulnerable to forms of subversion that were as elegant and complex as the engineering marvels that housed them. The investigation would continue for months, uncovering connections that reached across continents and into the highest levels of government. But the fundamental questions raised by the discoveries at the baths of Trajan would persist. How could a society maintain security while preserving the openness that made it great? How could the benefits of civilization be enjoyed without creating the vulnerabilities that came with complexity and sophistication? These were the true secrets of the Roman bathhouses, not just the activities that had taken place within their walls, but the eternal tensions between order and freedom, security and openness, that every great civilization must navigate if it wishes to survive and prosper.